Hello and welcome. My name is Biagio Mazza, Pastoral Associate at St. Sabina Parish in Belton, Missouri, and I'm here to welcome you to another Do You Know series question. As we continue our series on the history of the Mass, today's Do You Know question is, do you know how the Mass changed during the medieval period? Now, the medieval period often is referred to as a very lengthy period of almost 1,000 years, from 476 with the fall of the Roman Empire in the West to 1453, the fall of Constantinople in the East. So it's a long period of time. So for this video, we're going to focus primarily on the years 500 to 1,000, which would be the early part of the medieval period. As we mentioned before, we spoke about the liturgy up to about the year 600, and what we saw and noticed very clearly was that there was an increase in clergy taking over much of the liturgical action, with many of the people participating, rarely, if at all. So as a result of that, many changes began to occur in the liturgy. But one of the things you have to realize is the historical and cultural events that were going on. By the 7th century, roughly from 600 on, the Rome was almost a shell of itself. It had been many invasions, it had been sacked a number of times, and so on. And so it lost its prestige and its center of culture, and so on. As a matter of fact, Northern Europe, primarily France, Germany, and Constantinople in the East, were more active Christian centers than Rome were. And so as a result of that, we have the very little influence coming in from Rome with regards to the actual liturgy. This was also a period where there was no centralized civil authority, and feudalism developed as a way of operating, where you swore allegiance to a particular lord and he would protect you, and you'd have to be faithful to him. And so these little fiefdoms occurred all over Europe in trying to fend themselves off from enemies and so on. And so all this impacted the way liturgy was celebrated. One of the key things that have been going on since the year 325 and the heresy that surfaced at the time called Arianism was a continual fight with the Arianist heresy, which was prevalent and continued to remain despite the fact of being condemned. Now, Arianism actually denied the divinity of Jesus and basically said that Jesus was just a human being. And so as a result of that, what happened was a reaction on the part of the church to overly emphasize the divinity of Jesus at the expense of his humanity. And so within this kind of a context, what you end up having is kind of a God who is distant, and Jesus who is now Lord and Savior, but not necessarily one who is human like us. Roughly about the year 800, the Charlemagne from Northern Europe is crowned as the Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, and he attempts to consolidate and bring some sort of unity to the Christian life and to the liturgy in the empire. He welcomes a number of scholars to his kingdom in order to consolidate much of the teaching and so on. One of these scholars, Alcuin, actually proposes or institutes a practice with regards to the liturgy that's going to impact the liturgy for centuries. And what he proposes is that it's not all the people of liturgy who offer the sacrifice, but it's merely the priest who offers the sacrifice in the name of the people. And so as a result of that, what starts to happen is the overemphasis of the priest in the role of the one who offers the liturgy on behalf of the people, and the de-emphasizing the people's roles and participation in the liturgy. And so that you end up having all sorts of new customs and new traditions that get brought in. There's an appropriation of more and more the ministries of the liturgy into the hands of the priest, with the people not participating. The Eucharist now becomes primarily a sacrifice, seen more as an object of awe and fear and reverence, rather than an action done by all the people. In order to emphasize the purity of this sacrifice, unleavened bread is now used with a white wafer that is actually used, white wafer which is pure white, placed on the tongue, and there are no crumbs, and so no possibility of scattering the divine Lord. Communion on the tongue became a real practice at this time, with wine still being distributed but sipped through a straw because they were afraid of spillage and so on. We moved away from the one altar, the one focal altars, to many altars, so much so that now each in a monastery, for example, each monk or each priest wanted to celebrate his own private mass. And since he was offering in the name of the people, you didn't need people there. So you started having the proliferation of masses all over the place. And this continued this consolidation of all the ministry of the liturgy into the hands of the clergy, with the people no longer participating. And so what I would like to do is just read just a few of the rules and regulations that were prevalent in the 9th century, roughly about the year 950, by some local councils. And it tells you a lot about the what was happening with regards to the people and the liturgy. The rule number 1 was that the body and the blood of the Lord are to be received with fear and reverence. The priest is to clean the sacred vessel with his own hands. 3, no one is to chant unless he or she is fasting and receiving communion. 4, no woman may approach the altar or touch the chalice. 5, laymen and women were forbidden to carry communion to the sick. 6, priests are to admonish the faithful to receive 4 times a year: Christmas, Holy Thursday, Easter, and Pentecost. And 7, there are to be no masses in the people's home and no masses without a server. Many of these rules led to a kind of a real removing the action of the Mass away from the people and into the hands of the clergy, and an over-physical approach to the real presence of Christ led to the introduction of things like intinction, where you dip the host into the wine, and so that people no longer were receiving the cup itself. And actually the accepted practice, this became an accepted practice. And eventually, too, what would happen is the altar is now removed from the main part of the sanctuary, put against the wall, and now you had the priest saying Mass with his back to the people. And so many of these changes that occurred were a result of the various events that had developed culturally and historically, but also the theological developments that occurred with regards to what the liturgy was and who does liturgy. So I hope this has explained just a bit of what some of the changes occurred during this medieval period, and I hope we will return again to more Do You Know series questions as we can explore further how the Mass changed during the medieval period. Thank you very much.